All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the afternoon session of the Hot Topics and Trends in Construction. And welcome for anyone that's joining new and anyone that's was in our earlier session. You're also welcome. So we're going to explore the importance of cybersecurity in this session, which is one of those things that we probably hear from our clients on a weekly basis. Unfortunately, someone getting hit. And as I talk to the bankers, they also are hearing it even more so than us. But it's something that probably all of you don't want to deal with and don't want to think about until it's too late. So my partners here, Scott and Lopez over there, they're going to talk about some basic things for you to be prepared for and try to help you out a little bit on today's session. So best practices, anything along those lines. So today you're going to hear from, and by the way, they can't hear me, which is kind of comical with this whole situation here. So I'm going to just point to them here in a second. But we have Scott Petree. He's our cybersecurity guru. And then Mike Lopez is also joining, and he leads our construction outsourced technology support group. So both of them have a tremendous amount of experience in this area, a wealth of knowledge, and hopefully you guys enjoy this today. Thanks so much for letting us be part of this, and enjoy the session.
Hello. Hey, perfect. Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you'll be able to hear us throughout the presentation. We've had a little bit of technical difficulties, and if you can't, just please go ahead and indicate so in the chat room there. If we could just get maybe just an understanding of who's with us today, that'd be great. If you wouldn't mind just putting your name, your company, and maybe your role that you're with your company, just so we know who's participating in this presentation with us this afternoon. It's also being recorded, so if you're not able to join us live, you'll be able to catch the recording as well. My name is Scott Petree, and I am a partner in at Plante Moran in our cybersecurity practice. I also have with me
Mike Lopez, and I'm a partner in our managed IT practice for dealing with outsourced IT support and infrastructure. So happy to be here.
So we're going to talk a little bit today about best practices related to cybersecurity and IT, related to just the kind of current events that are going on, especially in cybersecurity, and making sure that you have some good tools in your pocket to be able to address IT needs as well as cybersecurity needs. And we'll go through some of those things this afternoon. So it looks like we've got Mark with us. Mark, you may be our one and only, so you get a full presentation all to yourself. If you have questions, please do not hesitate to stop us and ask questions, but we'd be happy to answer them throughout the process or at the end as well. So appreciate you being on with us. When we're talking about cybersecurity, we're really thinking about the ability to look into computer systems or have access to data, whether that's from internal, from a network perspective, or from an outside perspective or an outside threat actor. And what we're seeing today, and we continue to see, is that there's really three kind of main threat actors that we see out there. From being an organized crime, you've got hacktivists that are out there, and then you also have state-sponsored attacks as well. All three of which are after different things, but mainly looking at information that may be on your computer systems or on your network, and with the ultimate goal in most instances, especially when it comes to organized crime, for financial data or for financial means or for information data, or even disrupting your information systems in order to gain financial gain through either ransomware or some other form of computer attack. So we're seeing this quite a bit throughout the in the news, whether that's because of vendors and their patch management or their patches that they're providing. Actually, recently we saw a number of vendors send out major security updates, especially in the Microsoft space, where you've got some ancillary services that are able to gain access to the administrative level privileges. And then we've seen other things related to ransomware, and phishing continues to be part of those schemes that continue to hit the news, as well as organizations and disrupting the information flow, as well as just overall operations. I'm sure, Mark, if you have Outlook and a number of things, you're seeing a number of phishing emails that have come through. You're probably like most of us, tired of those emails that come back and forth, and ultimately, looking to disrupt business and try to coerce users to be able to click on a link or provide sensitive information. So what we're talking about in just ultimately, why does it matter? Why are we concerned about cybersecurity? I think what we want to do is protect our information systems. We want to make sure that organizations stay, ahead of the game, and so that you don't have the disruption, you don't have information or employee data or even customer data going out onto the internet or within places where it's unauthorized or shouldn't be going. And ultimately, I think what we're seeing, especially in the contracting, is you want to make sure that you've got a strong business in a brand, and making sure that name doesn't get out into bad news or bad press related to a phishing attack or some kind of data leak for your company and your organization. And then, specifically when you're talking about employee data, making sure their information stays protected as well. It's pretty often that you see where you've got an employer that has to put data protection on a number of employees, just because there was a data file that was sent out, whether it had tax information or social security numbers or other private information that ultimately could be used for identity theft or other financial gain for the bad actors. Things that we're seeing from obstacles to stronger security. I think the main thing that we see, and Mike, you probably see this quite a bit too in the IT space, is just lack of skilled personnel. We continue to see that this is the Great Resignation. Over the last probably 6 to 9 months, we've seen a number of individuals, whether that's through our clients or even through here at Plant Moran, or just stories of individuals moving on and moving from one job to another, on top of just a huge number of open positions. I think the last time I saw the number was close to 500,000 lack of skilled workers specifically in the cybersecurity space. So that there's a number of positions available and open. Unfortunately, globally, and then within the U.S., there's just a lack of individuals that have the necessary skill set to be able to help and maintain those strong security controls. Secondarily, the lack of budget. So a lot of organizations do reserve, and we're seeing an uptick on the budget for IT and cyber. But unfortunately, the cost of that it just continues to go up. And so there's almost kind of a catching up that's needed for most organizations to be able to address that gap related to budgetary needs, whether that's from a personnel perspective, tools, or just even working with outside consultants to upgrade systems and get them to a point where the current new tools which would help for cyber or for better IT is just not there just yet. So the other thing that we see, the last thing, is just lack of collaboration between departments. So you may have other parts of the organization that have a potential cyber attack, but they're what we're seeing is sometimes they're just not talking to each other, or there's no real incident response team to be able to handle some of the events to really identify and correlate data so that it could be, something could be stopped, whether that's, hey, this is the third time I've had to reset my password, or systems have been down, or it's interesting, we've seen cases where individuals have been asked to change, whether it's their vendor payment information or an employee's payroll information, but there's just not a lot of communication between departments so that can be correlated and potentially identified as a cyber event. Ultimately, who's to blame? And unfortunately, it's neither the employee side or the technology side. I think, a lot of it, because we've got organized crime that's out there, it can't really, IT and cyber professionals sometimes have that, chasing or pushing up the rock uphill continually and trying to get to a point where it's in a better state when you've got organized crime that is a little bit ahead or days ahead of IT and cyber. So that's not to say that there isn't, some things that we can do, and certainly want to talk about that. And, yeah, you're right, Mark. Don't the Russians have anything better to do? Hopefully they do. Ultimately, we do see some of those threats and state actor threats that come through from various state-sponsored, and hopefully those ultimately go down and are part of maybe campaigns that we can prevent and put to rest. But so we just want to go through today, part through of where can organizations and where can you better your IT and your cyber from the perspective of either strategic practices, operational practices, and tactical practices. And so from a strategic practice or perspective, that's really in the planning and putting together good policies and practices. Operationally is putting things into place so that they can actually be implemented, whether that's tools, whether that's things that help management, kind of better IT and better the cyber practices. And then tactically, it's really that area of, does it all work? Do the things that I plan to do, the things that we put together, do they actually work, and really do an assessment around that. So just getting a little bit deeper into that, you want to have ultimately a blueprint for success and kind of plan for your when a cyber event happens versus if a cyber event is going to happen. And I think that's something as as organizations kind of continue to think that it's not if, it's just a matter of when could this cyber event occur, and if what are the things that we can do to prevent a cyber attack and better IT practices within the organization. I think that the interesting thing that we've seen is that most cyber crimes that we see, they're really low-hanging fruit, and it's something that a lot of times could be avoided. I think a few years back, there was a statistic that the FBI had indicated that over 75% of data breaches could have been prevented because they were very low-level types of attacks or related to human error, within the organization. And so, if you think about that, that's quite a lot of potential data that could have been saved, and if organizations just had done a little bit of prevention through practices, and really you can't hope things are going to get better, and that hope is not a strategy, and ultimately luck is not a factor. You've got to actually put something in place that works for the organization, and not just cross your fingers to see if it's going to actually work. So where do you start? So I think where we see a lot of organizations think through from a cyber and an IT perspective is really doing an IT risk assessment this is similar or synonymous to if you're, going to obtain insurance for, your home, your car, your business. If you go apply for insurance, you're going to get an assessor or an agent that comes out and takes a look at the property. They'll ask questions. They'll kind of assess, how old is the property, or how, what's the kind of the underlying bones of that, insured place or place of business, or if it's your house. They'll start looking around. Do you have security systems in place? Do you have, deadbolts or locking mechanisms, those kinds of things. And that's very similar when you do an IT risk assessment. You really want to start with, where is your data? What does it look like? Where do we house it? How much information do we really have? Or are we sending and submitting all of our information out to vendors? And where can we be exposed, both from a data loss perspective as well as from, today's world, business interruption or business loss. We just had an incident where, just by sheer fact that a vendor's site went down. So if you were part of the Kronos, time clock system, there were some payroll companies that weren't able to process anything because Kronos was down for, I believe, a couple of weeks, and they really didn't have a process in place to be able to track and monitor, and then ultimately, put it into a payroll system to pay employees. So thinking about where your data is at, how susceptible is it to, having those types of risks, so that you can have, or that may affect business interruption, and then what can you do in order to prevent that from occurring, are things that you want to assess in your risk. Additionally, just looking at, the types of systems and access points within the organization. So if you have a lot of remote users, you may need to do and think through some of those processes in order to prevent, the remote access, or the ability to gain access, unauthorized access. So do you have things in place that either check for or validate that a user should be coming in to your organization through the VPN or through other remote access, facilities? So again, similar to just giving physical access to a building, you want to make sure that those controls are in place, and that you limit, whether it's physical keys or badges or those kinds of things to employees. You want to do the same thing when you're assessing your risk related to your organization and the data that you have. The other thing when we think about prevention, and that's, the strategic approach is really around training your employees. You wouldn't go through and just put somebody into your organization to work on a job site, or work in the office even, without doing proper training. Or you may end up having a number of incidents or accidents, as some of these cartoon characters here are displaying. But the more you can train your employees related to cybersecurity and best practices around IT, the better you'll be, in just them understanding where they fit in through the process. I think one of the things that we really want to stress is that, a lot of times our employees are the first line of defense, and then on the flip side, they are your first line of defense as well. And so making sure that they are aware that they could, be the part, or be a critical component of stopping a cyber event from occurring is pretty critical, in that they could, ultimately be the one that can help report a potential, malware coming in, or a phishing email that comes in into the organization, and stopping something that occurs that could take the company down for, a day or 2 days, or even, unfortunately, we've had companies that can't recover from a ransomware for weeks and months at a time. So things around cyber awareness training is critical. And I think this is something that we're seeing where organizations are doing it on, not just on an annual basis, but even through newsletters or monthly types of activities. Certainly, doing the testing related to what we call phishing tests or phishing campaigns. And so if your company is doing those types of things, I think that really does put cybersecurity and prevention at the top of the list. And then there's also tools that you can deploy that will help in that area as well for helping to prevent some of those items from coming into the organization in the first place. Can't say enough about passwords. I wish we could just say we don't need any passwords and we have, some kind of stronger token or something, that allows us to gain access. Unfortunately, passwords are here, and it's going to be a long time before they go away. But the other factor that really we should stress here is that, when you have a critical system and you have something that, is either accessible from external sources and you don't have really good control over that, what we're seeing organizations do is implement what's called multi-factor authentication. So for example, you may have your email access where you can get to it both, internally when you're in your company building, or you can get access to it, really pretty much anywhere outside of the organization, whether it's on your phone or through a web browser. And when you have that, and you have the ability, a hacker has pretty much, all the time in the world, if you will, to be able to try to crack a password. What we're seeing is that when it's just protected by a password, bad actors are gaining access to those email accounts and then creating, even better phishing campaigns, or really setting up and looking and watching over emails and then creating, a business email compromise attack where there might be, a number of vendor invoices altered or payment channels altered. But if you can put a secondary authentication, what's called multi-factor authentication, onto those systems, the password is still good, but you would have a secondary factor, whether it's oftentimes it's a secondary token value that you enter in after the password, user ID, password, and then this other factor that goes on. And that really can help prevent an unauthorized user from gaining access to those systems where they'll have to have that secondary factor. Is it foolproof? Unfortunately, no, it's not foolproof. However, it certainly does slow down those bad actors, and it can slow them down, just enough, just like that speed bump, where they'll just move on to another organization where they can get access to it. And again, just kind of thinking about bad actors and the cyber attackers that are out there, they're generally pretty lazy, and they're looking for those low-hanging fruits that are out there as well. One more thing on passwords, just to kind of think about it, we really are trying to change that concept into passphrases. And so it's not just a single word, and it's not, this idea that you can exchange numbers for letters. So if you've used in the past maybe the number 5 or the $sign to replace the letter S in your password, that can be programmatically set up so that if a bad actor does get access to your password, the encrypted password, it could truly be pretty quick, where these organized crime and bad actors out there, they can actually do nearly 18 to 50 billion attempts per second on a password. And so if you can imagine, the ability just to quickly put together a program that exchanges all the letters and numbers, as well as just common phrases that are out there in the dictionary. You want to just put together a passphrase that is a little bit more meaningful maybe to you, but not necessarily that's, common, like, I love my mom or something like that. That would not be a strong passphrase, but something that's a little bit, combination of two sentences or things that, that are less common will create that. Mark, you're right. Microsoft won't let you try that in a brute force attack, but a lot of times what happens is that these passwords get taken offline. They get captured while in session or in transit, and then the bad actors can take that encrypted the encrypted hash and then run it through an algorithm offline and ultimately come up with a matching hash that represents your password.
I think like what Scott said too, one thing to jump in is also the password length is probably the biggest piece of that too, right? So if it's at least 14 characters and it does have the complexity requirements, it takes that much longer than for one of those hackers basically to decrypt the password. So it does take, potentially years and years, right? Versus maybe days or hours to even crack the password. So the shorter the password, and if complexity is not turned on, then it's a matter of just hours before they can crack that, versus if the complexity is turned on and it's at least 14 characters or more, it takes years and years for that to be hacked then. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if your typical Microsoft kind of environment, if you have an 8-character password minimum with complexities turned on, our pen testers, our testers that we employ to test our companies or clients, they can gain access to those passwords within seconds. And so if it is an 8-character password with just some level of complexity versus if it's a 15, 16-character password, to Mike's point, it does take much longer. And oftentimes we're unable to even decrypt that password at the longer levels within a password itself.
I think Mark had one other thing here too on strategies to remember passwords. I think like what Scott said, it's more about thinking about it from, sentences that are easier to remember, right? Versus some people forget their password just because they've used the $ or the @ symbol to replace letters. And again, trying to alter that in different variations as they have to change their passwords every 90 days or 6 months, whatever that frequency is. It's probably easier to remember sentences like, I like to play baseball on Mondays, or something with an exclamation mark, or, something like with an uppercase character and different things throughout that sentence, right? To make the complexity meet that, but it's more of a sentence that you can easily remember versus having to substitute all the special characters in for the numbers and letters and things like that, right? So it's more of thinking about it from that, or a common phrase, just not something simple like Scott indicated earlier that's pretty easily hacked with three-letter words or things like that too. So
yeah, I've known people to take the newspaper or current events and kind of jumble that up a little bit too, Mark, to be able to create a good passphrase. And then if it's at least something that you're interested in or have an affiliation to, it's easier to remember that way as well. Okay. Compliance is another area, just from from a strategic perspective, just thinking about it as you start to look at your cyber program and your IT operations, just making sure that you're aware of what are your compliance requirements, whether they're contractual. You may have certain things that you have to do, within various projects or various jobs for your contracts. Or if you're working on any federal contracts, there may be some defense standards that are out there, whether that's through NIST 171 that's out there, or the new CMMC standard that is going to be implemented or being considered to be implemented within the next few years here. If you do have a number of data elements of customers or individuals that are in different states, you may have privacy requirements as well. Maybe not so likely here within this organization, within the construction, in areas that you guys are working with, but just something to consider, making sure that you bring in those elements of compliance as you think about implementing and putting together a strong cyber and IT operations.
Perfect. And this is our operational slide for cybersecurity tools and solutions that you can use within your organization, or a lot of companies obviously are looking at outsourcing, using either managed security services or a managed service provider to help out with many of these items, just to assist with that, just because they may not have an IT staff on board, or like Scott indicated on his previous slides, they may not have the skill sets or the capacity to evaluate the different alerts or monitoring aspects that are going on in an IT environment on a daily basis, and the amount of users obviously that they're supporting too as well, and applications within that organization. But to go through a few of these, the biggest items to have, obviously, I think a lot of these are pretty much probably known at this point in time to definitely have from a security perspective, but having a firewall between the internet connection and your guys' local area network, that's obviously key. That will block any potential open ports that might be open, or vulnerabilities for people to access from the external outside through the internet into your organization, and the data that might be on your servers or other workstations that you guys have within your organizations. Another key item is obviously the patch management. So I think everybody's pretty well aware of Microsoft and the continual need to update, Windows and server operating systems. So both on the workstation side and the servers. Typically, we recommend that workstations are patched on a daily basis, because again, sometimes they might be off. People might be off for a week and things like that, to connect back and have those things check in on a daily basis to ensure that they're fully patched and compliant. Will prevent against kind of those attacks, like Scott said, if there's something that a user clicks on, or potential known hole or vulnerability, and they're either traveling or might be at a client location or things like that, that at least hopefully they're protected from those threats then if it's trying to infiltrate the computers. Servers, we typically say they're normally patches are released for cumulative updates on a monthly basis. And it's typically the second Tuesday of every month that Microsoft releases those. So those are items that should be installed within 7 to 14 days of those coming out. Servers are a little bit more trickier, probably just because the applications that reside on there, you might have to test out or ensure that they're compatible with anything new that comes out on those. So
You said Patch Tuesday?
Patch Tuesday, correct. Yep.
You know what Wednesday's called?
What's that?
Hacking Wednesday.
There you go.
All the hackers get all the things that need to be patched. So they have a script on how to gain access to systems.
Two other items I think on here too that is a big one is endpoint detection and response, and even vulnerability scanning. So those are kind of more of one is more being proactive, right? If you're doing vulnerability scanning, you're trying to decide or detect what potential holes are open within the network or systems externally, as well as even internally. You can assess that. So things like Scott said with his team on the cybersecurity side, they can come in and hook up a workstation and can basically scan the network to detect vulnerabilities or access points into sensitive information or applications that might be vulnerable, that they can then gain access to that data. And so a lot of times IT departments or outsourced providers will do that proactively, just to ensure that they are secure and that things are patched and not vulnerable. And if there are, like similar, like you probably heard in the news with like Log4j, was a Java vulnerability that a lot of clients had issues with just outdated applications and things like that. Those are items that we're talking about that can detect that and hopefully prevent that from happening. So endpoint detection and response too, that's one of the biggest ones to detect if there is an issue. It can actually look at now registry items that are being modified on a computer. If a file is downloaded and executed, what's it actually doing? Is it storing data? Is it doing a key logger? Those are items that can report back to IT as well too, then to tell what those issues are. Scott brought up security awareness training. That is definitely the first line of defense, and something that clients that we see have implemented on just an ongoing basis, that either their personnel's partaking in those classes on a monthly basis, and they do phishing simulations or campaigns too as well, just to test them and to see if they're actually falling for these attacks or the phishing simulations, so that way they can actually prevent those from occurring in the first place. And then monitor and help desk backups, all those are also key again. So monitor and help desk is kind of related, that those will hopefully create automated tickets for the IT to look into. And it's also a way to track, right? So you guys can go back and look at the historical patterns and what's happening, and the trend and analysis too, to make decisions behind that of what to implement next and such. And then backups obviously is a key recovery to ransomware, so you're not hopefully having to pay the ransomware or things like that to gain back access back to your data. Hopefully there's an ability to recover from maybe a day or two prior that you're not having to pay the ransom and things like that. And then you also have the ability to be online quickly without having to wait days or hours for that system to come back online then. So
I think there's a term there for backups from ransomware is having an air gap between your live data and your backup data.
Correct, right. And a lot of the backup solutions now can detect at least the data that's backing up now if it is actually infected with ransomware, because sometimes those are based on time length or when it will actually go into effect. So it will actually alert you on when the data is corrupted and if the backup is corrupted, so that way you can go hopefully remediate that before it becomes an issue and downtime's experienced too.
Yeah, and I think one thing just to think about there is if you have backups and it's reporting failures, that somebody's following up on those failures. We had an incident, or we had a case where an organization where they were getting the failures, but the bad actors were going in and deleting those failures, and then they kept deleting them all the way up until the point where they only had a 14-day rotation on their backups, and then on the 15th day they went ahead and encrypted all of their data. The company thought they had good backups, but because they weren't following up on the failed backups, they didn't have any data to go back to.
So these are items that we call this a cyber dashboard. So I talked a little bit about this on the previous slide, but this is really items that you should be proactively tracking or discussing with the IT team or whoever's leading the IT efforts within your organizations. And so a lot of these items relate around more of a proactive checklist, and then as well as from that checklist then creating reports or associated just compliance towards those items. So like I mentioned, a few things: firewall rules. Those are items that should be reviewed on a monthly basis. If there's a port that's not needed, that's opened, to close that down if it's no longer needed, and to evaluate those on a continual basis once a month. Because again, if something's open, it's very easy for those bad actors to basically gain access into the network, or hackers that are trying to do that, because they can constantly scan IP addresses or ports that are available. Phishing emails, again, I talked a little bit about the simulations, but making sure that you know what percentage of employees are falling for those attacks, and that you can hopefully do a benchmark that with the security awareness training as time goes on, hopefully those become less and less of an issue. And so the lower percentages tell you that, obviously the security awareness training is working, and plus employees just know what to look for then in those emails and not to fall for the bait. Malware, again, if things are detected, it's more to log that and where they came from and the source, and to understand why that came through, and then to actually proactively hopefully identify and prevent against that in the future. Those are also good incidents just to detect and find out, and to keep in event. So if there is something that happens again in the future, it's easily able to go back to and at least see what happened through that. Account lockouts, understanding why accounts are being locked out. There are applications that can actually detect if there's multiple failed attempts with, like Mark asked earlier about, okay, if it's tried 6 billion times, can we actually get alerted on that? You can with 365. So if you have an account that's being compromised or trying to get hacked into, you can also get alerts or email alerts based on that in the audit and policies, and to review that as well too. Data file access, again, we always call this a least privileged access if you can, is to lock down security and permissions to your most sensitive data or client data, and to not allow it to be opened either A, externally, or B, to all employees within the company. So if you can do that, that will prevent against kind of those breach and the sensitive information hopefully being gained access to if there is a security breach or incident that occurs. And that, again, is something that should be continually reviewed once a month at least, just to ensure that you guys are protecting your data that's most sensitive, and that it is locked down to only the people that need access to that data. Tickets resolved, again, looking at what those systemic issues are and looking at trends and analysis on those. If we have a repeated offender that is having those breaches or attacks, we need probably to figure out where that source is coming from, and actually look at that, not just saying, okay, I've completed the ticket for that user and close it out, but understanding that broader picture of why is this reoccurring, or what potentially could you do to be proactive about that. Downtime and uptime obviously is good metrics to monitor too. Obviously, if there's no downtime or minimal downtime, and it's we talk about 5.9 uptime, that's great. If it's something that's, we're only up 80% of the time and we're down another 20% of the time, then that's probably something to address and look at and actually monitor that piece. And a lot of times now, like Scott mentioned, with SaaS providers or even hosting providers, a lot of times they do have things built into their contracts for SLAs for credits based on that if there is lengthy downtime and you don't have access to data, or in data loss prevention, things like that. So a lot of the cloud providers have built that into the contracts, and that's probably something to evaluate as well too as part of that. Geography, external scans. Again, geography, we talk about this, and it's a thing that, even in 365, a lot of you might have heard about geolocation and locking down only known countries that you're working in. So if you know that, okay, we work with Mexico and United States, to only allow access from both of those countries, but to lock down everything else, especially like Mark brought up earlier about Russia, if that's a location that you're not doing business with, then just don't even allow the traffic inbound or to your firewall or to email or things like that. So you can definitely do that. It's obviously a different subscription service with 365, for instance, but there's definitely things out there that can hopefully prevent known countries from coming in from that piece on geolocation. External scans, we talked about that as well too, just making sure that you are continually either doing penetration testing, like Scott said, to see how you can actually hack or get into the network. And that might be something that you do on an annual basis too, and to track those as well. So and I've covered a little bit about this with the patch management piece, but this is definitely key. So this includes more than just Windows and even Office updates and things like that. That's obviously a pretty common item that I think most people are aware of. The things that I think most companies forget or maybe don't have a process in place for is more about the networking updates, firewall updates. Those items are also susceptible to these attacks, or even like with the Java or application, business applications, like databases or things like that. If you're not doing the patching on those, or maybe the application's several years old and not something that's something that you're updating on a continual basis, or have a vendor that is doing that for you, those are things to evaluate, because those are the most susceptible. So we've had some clients, for instance, that maybe had an application from 2015 and they haven't done any of those updates on it, and it's running on an old server and everything like that. Those applications are definitely more susceptible and prone to ransomware or breaches or security incidents, just from the vulnerabilities because of the age of those applications and such. So again, with patch management, it's looking at it collectively as a whole, from the network, application, server, and the workstation side, because even like the firewall firmware and those updates, or if you're not replacing network switches every 5 to 7 years and they're kind of end of life, those are items that are definitely susceptible to gaining access to networks, and like Scott said, to even monitor for password input and things like that. So
I just saw something recently on the patch, on the top, I think like 15 security patches. There were only 2 or so that were current, and the rest were either from 2017 or earlier. So just thinking of it from that perspective, that there are still systems out there that are unpatched, that are years behind, is pretty scary. And so, the bad actors have very easy systems to come through, but just keeping up on patches, like Mike said, is definitely critical.
This is another item too with vendor evaluation, and this is something that anything that you go into working either with a SaaS provider, a hosting provider, items that basically any vendor that's going to host or use your data, even if it is somebody that you're working with collaboratively to deliver a project, there's items that you probably should gather from any vendor in order to evaluate them and their security controls and processes around that, especially if they're going to have access to potentially your company data or resources, just to ensure that you're doing your due diligence to ensure that you're remaining secure, at least with your network, if you have to provide that access externally to other vendors. Or even if they're going to house your data, right, for an ongoing basis. And so what we put in here is kind of 3 easy steps. One is to complete an initial risk assessment, and essentially that could be asking them for what their security controls, compliance, like Scott mentioned, if they have a SOC report, that might be items that you ask for as part of that. And so evaluating what are they doing for their best practices and their security around that before you actually allow the access in to your data, or you move your data to their platforms. And so those are items that definitely evaluating that before you make any move or access move. That's something that you should initially ask for, and should be something that should be readily available if they are serious about the security and in the resource protection for data, because again, if they're not doing best practices, or they may not have a SOC report that indicates of what they're doing for the controls behind that and for access and security and things like that, then you could be at risk then for, again, a data breach. Part of that risk assessment then is obviously going to be establishing that risk management framework. And so Scott brought up a couple of items, like there's items like CIS 20 or NIST or things like that that you could use and pull points or parts from that to establish your own risk management framework if you don't want to adopt one that's maybe readily out there, because they are pretty intensive with some of the controls. And so you'll notice that probably most organizations probably aren't compliant if you were to look at NIST from a standard and things like that for security. So there might be best practices and points that you pull from those to then put that into your evaluation and establish that framework when you are selecting a new vendor or allowing that vendor access in. And then again, it's not something that ends once you've selected it, right? Just because, again, platforms change, software's upgraded, vendors change, there's mergers and acquisitions that happen. So again, you need to probably continuously identify, monitor, and manage the risk. So it's, again, probably asking on an annual basis for, is there any changes or updates to the contracts? Has software changed on an annual basis? What upgrades have they done in that past year? Does their access still need to be the same? Can you limit access? So those are things that you probably need to look at on an ongoing basis versus, okay, the contract's signed, we looked at it once and we move on and never look at it again. So that's something that definitely to keep that on an annual review process for sure as well too.
Yeah, and that might be part of the contractual compliance too, that you have to monitor your subs as well. So right. Something just to maintain and consider. The other things when you think about, again, kind of going back to the strategic, operational, and then the tactical pieces around prevention, one of the things that we do see a lot of times, it's in this testing of your administrative and technical safeguards. Through penetration testing or network security assessments. Just remember that the bad actors, they have not just 2 pen testers or 2 hackers, they've got an entire room full of these individuals that's all they do every day. They've got a group that just scours IP addresses or internet sites that have potential vulnerabilities. Then they pass it off to the next set of hackers that actually then can exploit those vulnerabilities. They've got another set of hackers or bad actors that then can gain access to those systems, extract data. And then they've got a whole other set of bad actors that can do something with that data, maybe sell it off, create specific malware or targeted malware to those organizations. So if they're doing all of that, then just at a minimum, doing a penetration test, an annual pen test against your external sites, which are devices and systems that are readily available from the outside or from the internet, is definitely something that we encourage organizations to do, at least on an annual basis. And then potentially doing, the vulnerability scans on maybe on a semi-annual basis where that you're looking at, what are those patches or other potential holes do we have in those systems when we consider from the outside. The other form of pen testing that we see organizations really focus in on is, when is an internal pen test, which means, when and if an organization has a compromise. So you could imagine that you have maybe a disgruntled employee or a trusted vendor that may have access to some of your systems internally, or more often than not, it's a compromised workstation where somebody from the outside has a foothold on a workstation. What can they do once they're in? And that pen test can really provide you with some really good information related to how far can somebody go once they're inside your organization. Can they escalate privileges? Can they gain access to other systems and data? And really, can they get to what we call administrative type of credentials to be able to do and potentially disrupt your organization? So doing those types of testing certainly is part of good practices when it comes to tactical approach for cybersecurity and IT. The other area is really around IT assessment and cybersecurity assessment.
Yeah, so the top part, we've outlined it here. And so a lot of times when we look at an IT assessment, organizations might approach us and say, hey, we're confused about some alignment with either the business operations with technology. And so a lot of those times it might revolve around staffing. So we evaluate, people and skill set, and do we need other additional capacity, or looking at outsourcing and things like that for an organization. The strategic alignment, again, IT or technology should be supporting the business and not be a cost center, hopefully viewed as that, or it shouldn't be something that's maybe not viewed as a strategic alignment to hopefully, meeting business goals and objectives. Other items that we look at as part of that too is the budgeting process. So on an annual basis, hopefully there is an IT budget that's set aside that operationally what you're spending, as well as the capital expenditures, and kind of getting on that technology lifecycle plan like we talked about. So maybe workstations are rotated out every 3 to 4 years, network equipment's every 5 to 6 years, and evaluating just kind of what you're spending, and doing even comparisons on cloud analysis too as well on an ongoing basis. Infrastructure, I talked a little bit about this on the previous slides, but even evaluating on-prem infrastructure and how do you migrate that to the cloud or cloud-based services for infrastructure as a service. A lot of those items are things now that clients are asking a lot about, especially since COVID, and obviously working remote and working from home. Was one of those things that even offering flexibility. Those are options that we have to evaluate and look at as part of that, and what can or cannot go to the cloud. And maybe what's not compatible, at least with internet connectivity or those type of things in access. And then even applications, right? Some applications might be outdated, and there might be better roadmaps or platforms to go to at this point. And so just knowing what's out there and evaluating all of those items are things that we look at related to the IT assessment. So most of those are related around infrastructure, staff, and the strategy and budget, and just making sure that you guys have a plan going forward, an IT plan in place on an annual basis, honestly, for evaluating those items.
And then the other side of that is then doing a cyber assessment and looking at it from a security perspective. Again, looking at the network and some of the infrastructure kind of components, but making sure that you have a clear path of authenticated or authorized authenticated users, but then making sure that the unauthorized authenticated users are staying out, and you have the ability to really control that. Looking at users and access within either the network, within applications, making sure that you have, again, the right users being able to access the right information and systems. Again, back to vendors, evaluating vendors, making sure that they're upholding their contractual obligations, as well as any data security requirements that you may have to impose on them. And then thinking about incident response, this is really something that we're seeing a lot of organizations really focusing on, because there are a number of cyber events that occur. How well are we doing, or how well is your organization doing to address those cyber events, and can you respond quickly to a cyber event in the form of identification, recovery, and then as well ultimately back up, responding to a point where you can get back up and running from a cyber event that occurs. And then just looking at the different threats that are out there as well, making sure that you're addressing those common threats and vulnerabilities. This is where you might really think about ransomware or other vulnerabilities that are out there. Lastly, just thinking about, again, tactically, a lot of organizations are implementing or obtaining rather cyber insurance for their organization and related cyber events. There's a number of things that go into looking at these policies. We are not cyber insurance experts by any means, but just something to think about when you look to kind of measure your risk and look at spreading out your risk based on where can what can we accept, and then where can we transfer some of that risk as we're looking at the organization. And a lot of companies are definitely doing that through cyber insurance, and a number of factors within that as well. Good old adage, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. I think Ben Franklin kind of summed that up quite well, especially when you think about cybersecurity and just the process in order to put good plans together, good cybersecurity practices, good IT practices in place in order to prevent those data data breaches and cyber events from occurring within your organization. Mark, I know you asked a few questions throughout. I know we're just right at the time. If you have any other questions, feel free to type them up. Otherwise, really appreciate your attention and your joining us today. If others join, please feel free to put a question in the chat if you have them. We'll hang out for a few minutes here. Okay. Perfect. Well, thanks again. We've got our contact information there if you need it as well. And Deb, really appreciate you allowing us to share some of our thoughts and ideas. And if there's any question that kind of comes up afterwards throughout the rest of your conference, please let us know. Happy to respond to them later.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.